Again, welcome everyone. I'm Sharon Tree, and this is Lessons from Maine, Food, Farm, and Forever Chemicals. A couple of technical details. Claudia, if you could show the slide. I think most people know their way around Zoom by now, but if you have a question for any of the panelists, we're going to be taking the questions at the end of their presentations. Please put your question in the question and answer function. Rather than the chat, it's hard for us to monitor both of those channels. The chat is great though. If you have links for information or want to tell people where you're from, we encourage you to do that. And we encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A function during the presentations as you think of them, because that'll help us get off to a good start with the discussion at the end. By way of introduction, again, I'm Sharon Treat. I'm senior attorney at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, or IETP. We're based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We have offices in Washington, D.C. and Berlin, Germany, and several of our staff work virtually. I'm coming to you from Maine, which was settled on the traditional territory stewarded by the Wabanaki Confederacy, including the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot, the Maliseet, and the Micmac peoples. A little bit about IETP. We work locally and globally to ensure fair and sustainable food, farm, and trade systems. We do this through research, collaboration, and policy advocacy. Our work on PFAS in Maine has encompassed all of these approaches, and we've worked closely over the past 3 years with the organizations and the legislators who are participating in this webinar. Today's webinar is an important next step in that work, as we bring to a wider national and global audience the outstanding and innovative work being done in the state of Maine to address the scourge of per and polyfluoral substances, and that's known as PFAS, that have contaminated soils, water, and food, harm some farmers' health and their ability to continue to farm, and damage the state's brand as a place with a clean and healthy environment and agriculture that is built on sustainable farming practices. We believe it is critical to bring this information to a broad audience, for Maine's PFAS problems are not unique to that state. Every US state has been spreading sewage and wastewater treatment sludges onto farmland where livestock graze and crops are grown. National attention has thus far been on military installations, firefighting foam, and manufacturing plants as PFAS pollution sources. Far less attention has been paid to how PFAS-laden wastes are being directly applied to soils and the impact this practice is having on agriculture and on our food. So here's how the webinar will work. I'm going to introduce the speakers now as a group in alphabetical order. And then I have a very short introductory 2 slides about with some PFAS information and about the webinar. And that's the 3 organizational panelists are going to be speaking together and sharing one presentation, and they'll be followed by Maine Representative Bill Pluker. And our goal is to finish the presentations by the top of the hour and leave a good 30 to 45 minutes for discussion among all of the speakers in response to your written questions. And we'll end the webinar by 2:45 Eastern time. Okay, so let's get to it. We have a really outstanding panel of speakers. They've all been deeply involved in bringing to light and addressing the Maine PFAS crisis. Sarah Alexander has been executive director of the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Associations, we call MOFGA, since 2018. She's a native of rural Ohio and attended Northwestern University. After college, Sarah spent 3 years at the White Earth Indian Reservation in northern Minnesota, working with the White Earth Land Recovery Project, helping to restore traditional food systems and stopping the genetic engineering of wild rice. Before moving to Maine in 2015, she worked for nearly 10 years to protect organic standards and strengthen consumer labeling at Food and Water Watch in Washington, D.C. Ellen Stern Griswold has just been named Vice President and Deputy Director of the Maine Farmland Trust, or MFT. Before her recent promotion, she was MFT's Research and Policy Director, overseeing municipal, state, and federal level policy. Ellen previously practiced federal energy regulatory law for 8 years in Washington, D.C., before pursuing a new career in agriculture and food policy. She obtained her LLM in food and agriculture law from Vermont Law School, her law degree from Georgetown University Law Center, and her BA in public policy from Brown University. Representative Bill Pluker is serving his second term in the Maine House of Representatives. Representative Pluker is a member of both the Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry Committee and the Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee. He is a vegetable farmer and teaches farm apprentices everything from growing crops, online marketing, and how to operate a small business successfully. He has a bachelor's degree from Pittsburgh College, and together with his wife, Reba Richardson, he operates Hatchet Cove Farm in Warren, Maine. And finally, Sarah Woodbury is Director of Advocacy at Defend Our Health, where she works closely with legislators, coalition partners, and supporters to advance Defend's mission of fighting for safe products, food, and drinking water, and sustainable green jobs. She has over 10 years of advocacy experience and communications experience. Before joining Defend Our Health, Sarah spent 8 years with the Anti-Defamation League as a part of their government relations, advocacy, and community engagement team. And she has also been part of the media team for Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She has an MA in Applied Politics from American University and a BS in Political Science from Portland State University. Okay, so please, next slide, please. Could I have the next slide? Oh, here we go, sorry. Okay, so just a quick overview. You're going to hear all about these things during this presentation. And starting just with a little bit about PFAS characteristics, and then getting into how PFAS was discovered in Maine, the current status of the PFAS investigation and agricultural research, the work that Maine Farmland Trust and Maine organic farmers and gardeners are doing to respond to this, a lot about what's happened in the legislature and what needs to happen both in Maine and at the federal level going forward. Next slide. Okay, and just a bit here about forever chemicals. I'm not going to get into all the science about it, but there are many characteristics about PFAS that make it particularly concerning when it comes to agriculture. The first thing to know, and most people on this, this webinar do know this, is that PFAS are ubiquitous. They're in all kinds of consumer health and agricultural products. We found them in pesticides. They're in manufacturing processes. They're in food packaging. They're in clothing. There are many, many versions of PFAS chemicals, and every time I look at the scientific literature, there's even more that are listed. And unfortunately, our federal EPA continues to approve new PFAS chemicals going forward, despite what we know about them. They're incredibly persistent. And one of the notable things about the situation in Maine is that some of the contamination we're seeing goes back to sludges that were spread 30 years ago and not since. And they're still contaminating. They are now today contaminating food, water, and soils. They are also highly mobile. They move great distances from where the contamination started. And that is the case both in groundwater, but we're also seeing it with air transport from PFAS that have been incinerated or manufacturing facilities where even places in the Canadian Arctic now have high levels of PFAS in people's blood and nursing mothers' breast milk. They are also bioaccumulative, and this is part of the Arctic story. As it goes up the food chain, different types of PFAS can concentrate and become even more, seriously noticeable and affect your, potentially affect health of both animals and human beings. And of course, there are health effects from this, and I've listed a number of them here in terms of weakened immune responses, cancers, reduced fertility, and kind of messing around with people's hormonal system, both developmental delays on the one hand, and increased in accelerated puberty in another. And then finally, a point I would like to make here is that these kind of bad characteristics are not limited to these older so-called legacy long chain PFAS that were the initial PFAS that were developed. They also are reflected in the newer PFASs that were developed to replace the earlier ones. And so This is a concern that is not limited to chemicals that were in wide usage a bunch of years ago. They continue to be a problem with the newer chemicals. So with that as an introduction, I'm now going to turn over the webinar to our panel. Again, Sarah Alexander from MOFGA, Ellen Griswold from Maine Farmland Trust, and Sarah Woodbury from Defend Our Health.
Thanks, Sharon. I'll just wait for Claudia to get our PowerPoint up there and get started. Thank you. Next slide, please. So to, while she's bringing that up, to kind of tell the story of Maine, we want to go back to the beginning to how this started. So Maine has become a leader in the issue of PFAS in a variety of different categories, from source reduction to remediation to kind of funding to help those impacted. And that all stems from a story of Fred Stone. So for those that don't know Fred and Laura Stone, they own Stone Ridge Farm. It's a 100-year-old dairy farm that has been in their family for generations. And back in about 2016, 2017, some routine testing of a well on their property found high levels of PFAS. And so that caused Fred to take a look at the milk that his cows were producing to see if there was some contamination there. So Fred took it upon himself to do this testing. He was not required to do so. PFAS were not regulated in milk at the time. So he did some testing, found the high levels of PFAS in his dairy milk, informed Oakhurst, who at the time was selling his milk. Obviously, he had to stop selling his milk to Oakhurst. He did everything that he possibly could to clean up his farm. He ended up having to kill most of the cows on his farm and bring in new ones. He trucked in his food from out of state. He put $20,000 into a filtration system on his water. And for a while that seemed to help. But unfortunately, because his land was so contaminated, the contamination came back because PFAS are so ubiquitous, they don't go away. His milk started being more contaminated again. So he just had to stop selling it. He and his family are financially ruined because of this issue. They are experiencing some health impacts that could possibly be because of the exposure to PFAS. But Fred did the right thing. He spoke out. We started working with Fred in about 2019 to tell the story of this contamination and to raise the alarm that Fred was not the only one. Fred's farm was contaminated because of the spreading of biosolids on his farmland. And he had not done spreading since the late 80s, early 90s. So it had been a number of years, but because PFAS stick around so much, they were just there. So next slide. So because of kind of Fred's story, the governor's office put together a PFAS task force that was comprised of several different agencies, public health advocates, and other folks to look at the issue of PFAS. And in the process of that task force work, they did some testing of wastewater sludge, both industrial and municipal. This is not just an industrial sludge problem, and found that over 95% of the wastewater sludge tested above the screening standards that the state had set for PFOA and PFOS and one other PFAS. So the governor's task force took all of this information. They put forward a bunch of recommendations around source reduction, remediation, help for impacted communities, and kind of went on from there. And so what came out of that was Defend, working with the legislature and other coalition partners, worked to get several pieces of legislation passed in 2020 and 2021. So one of the pieces of legislation we got passed was LD 1600. That requires investigation of all of the sites in the state where the municipal and the industrial sludge had been spread to look at levels of PFAS in our farmland. The state has about 700 sites going back over about 40 years, and they are in the process of doing that testing. They have tiered that testing information. They are in the process of looking at and doing some of that testing and trying to figure out where we have hotspots and high levels of contamination. In that time frame, also there came out the story of Tozier Farm, which was another dairy farm, which is even more highly contaminated than Fred's farm. And unfortunately, the contamination at Tozier Farm kind of spread to the neighboring community, and there are over 200 drinking water wells in Fairfield that have been contaminated because of this biosolid spreading, even though those folks didn't spread it on their land. It kind of trickled down from the Tozier farm. So we have 2 contaminated farms, we have over 200 contaminated wells. And so the legislature started taking action on some of this stuff to try to, get some funding, to try to do some source reduction. And so along with the testing that came out of LD 1600, the governor allocated about $30 million. She actually asked for 40, but got $30 million for investigation and cleanup. And that was in 2021. The legislature also passed a couple of bills for source reduction, LD 1503, first in the world piece of legislation, first in the nation, first in the world. The state of Maine will require by 2030 that any product being sold in the state not have PFAS in it unless it's an essential use. And that's things like medical equipment and stuff like that. Industry can make the argument that their use is essential to the department who will go through rulemaking, but they will have to prove that it is an essential use. And so no product will be able to be sold in the state of Maine by 2030 that uses PFAS that is not an essential use of that. And that will start with banning the use of PFAS in rugs, carpets, and aftermarket stain treatment. And that will be done by 2023. Another part of LD 1503 that hopefully will be helpful to other states is that the state is requiring industry manufacturers to report to the state the use of PFAS. So if you sell a product in the state of Maine, you have to report that use of PFAS to the DEP. They will have an online database that folks can go access to look at that information. And it is our hope that that database will help both consumers and other states kind of track the uses of PFAS. We also passed LD 1505, which banned the use of PFAS in firefighting foam. And then we set some standards for 6 PFAS in drinking water. We mirrored after Massachusetts and Vermont, but it's still one of the strongest in the nation. It sets a standard of 20 parts per trillion, 20 ppt for a combination of 6 PFAS in water. The federal advisory level is 70 parts per trillion. So our drinking water standards are much higher than most of the rest of the nation. So that was kind of the background and where we're at today. But Maine has taken some really amazing steps to deal with the issue of PFAS contamination. Next slide. Turn it over to Ellen, I believe.
Yes, great, thank you. So I just posted in the chat a link to the map that's reflected on the slide in case folks want to check it out. But as Sarah mentioned, legislation passed in 2021 that requires the Maine DEP to conduct soil and groundwater sampling at all sites that were licensed for land, application of wastewater sludge and septage. And as Sarah also mentioned, this equates to over 700 sites around the state. DEP is prioritizing the testing of sampling sites based on a variety of different factors, but including the volume of the material that was applied, whether the materials came from several different generators, whether those materials included industrial sources, and then also the proximity to residences. The goal is to have all tier 1 or highest priority sampling completed in 2023, and then to sample all sites by 2025. This map was one that MFT created that automatically draws upon the data in DEP's testing map, but it also allows us to integrate mapping data of the farms within our network and actually other organizations' networks as well, so that we can assess which farms we work with might be impacted. The link that you're might be viewing just includes the DEP data, but we do have that capability to really assess risk for the farms in our network. It is important to note that the pins on the map show sites where spreading was permitted or licensed, but it might not reflect where spreading actually occurred. And that's part of the investigation that DEP is going through right now, although they are updating their map to reflect when spreading actually occurs once they confirm that. We always receive this question, so I just want to address it up front, that it's really not possible to accurately predict how many farms will be impacted at this point. Our goal is sort of to ensure that the information and support programs are in place so that as the situation unfolds, we have enough of a safety net for the farmers within our state. But given that we're so early on in the testing, we really will have to see, how many farms are in fact impacted. But we do use the map to help farms within our network assess their potential for risk. And this map obviously does drive home the extent of the possible contamination. I did want to note, though, that not all of the farms that are doing testing are reflected in Tier 1. There are some farms that DEP has identified as potential sites, but are lower priority, and so are in sort of proactively testing because they don't want to wait as long for the results. There are farms who are also proactively testing because their customers are asking for that information. And finally, there are some farms who are proactively testing because even though they're not on DEP's list, they either because they know it themselves or because they've heard from neighbors or others that there might be a history of spreading on their land. And so they're proactively investigating that. Next slide, please. And this is Sarah.
Great, thanks, Ellen. So a lot happened between 2019 and the end of 2021 when that map was first published by the DEP. Obviously, none of that work would have happened without the legislative mandates, I think, to really bring to light the possible extent of spreading within the state. I will say organizationally at MOFGA, we had been working with a single farm prior to 2021, a dairy farm that had found contamination. It was an organic dairy farm. Their levels were, considerably lower than what was found at Stone's and Tozer's farm. But I think prior to the DEP map being published, we really thought, okay, maybe this is a more isolated situation, particularly for dairy farms. And there was some hope in the work that was done, with a dairy farm whose levels were lower, that potentially through research and mitigation and getting clean water and clean feed in, that there could be a viable path forward for farms. And then a lot has happened just in the last 6 months, which we're sort of referring to as phase 2 of the PFAS crisis in Maine, which is that once that map was published and farms started to see their farms on the map or areas surrounding them that may have been spread, there was a much higher level of awareness that came forward about who might be impacted by this and who may be at risk. So that brings us to Songbird Farm, Johanna Davis and Adam Nordell, who you can see here on the slide. They actually were alerted in early December of 2021 by a customer that their farm showed up on this map that DEP had published as a licensed spreading site. And so they took it upon themselves. Once again, there's a theme here with many of our farms, being really proactive in this and not necessarily waiting for the state to do testing, but they took it upon themselves to test their water, their soil, and some of their crops. And they got test results back on the initial round of testing just a few days before Christmas in 2021. And their levels were through the roof. The drinking water standard in the state of Maine is 20 parts per trillion, and their well water was over 8,000 parts per trillion. So really high levels of contamination that they had no awareness of. This is an organic farm who had bought the farm from a previous organic farmer, and as some of you may know, spreading and the use of biosolids and sludge is not permitted under the National Organic Program. And so they were not aware of any history of spreading. But as they learned more about their particular property, they learned that 2 farm owners previously, there had been spreading that had occurred. The last of it was in the early 90s. So decades before they acquired the farm and before the previous organic farm owner had acquired the farm. And this is becoming a common story. Adam and Johanna have been very public about their story. They've wanted to share their story more broadly to help folks understand the impact of this and what it means for a farm to go through this, what it means for the farmers specifically. And they've been very proactive in both pulling their products from the shelves, taking actions that were not required by the state, to really showcase the situation, the possible hazards of this, the contamination. They've shared their personal impact. So their farm, after they got their test results back, they pulled all product from the market. They had no income coming in to their farm. They had high plans, high hopes for the 2022 season. They were growing, they were making investments in their farm, but all of that came to a halt. They did their own testing of their blood serum and how PFAS may have affected them. And their test results that they've also shared publicly are extremely high, higher than factory workers in the 3M and DuPont plants that are making these chemicals. And that's primarily thought to be because they were not only drinking highly contaminated water, they were eating the crops, from their farm fields that were grown in contaminated soil, and they were working in the soil. And so they were also inhaling dust particles of airborne PFAS from the soil. And so they're personally impacted. They're monitoring that. They have a 4-year-old son who is also impacted by this. He was breastfed by Johanna, and when they look at their samples between the two of them, Adam's blood serum levels are significantly higher than Johanna's, and the state toxicologist's idea for why that was, that he shared with them, was that it was likely because she was breastfeeding their son, and so that was passed on to the next generation. And so they're currently have closed their business. They have done more testing to find, what are the levels of contamination in their soil, in their other products, and have determined that they're not able to have a viable farm in their current location now, both for their own health and for their customers' health, and have been, advocating and working over the last 6 months to really show the actions that are needed. So Adam and Johanna were the first farm in this wave, but quickly within January and February of 2022, there were several more farms in the same area who came back with also high levels of water contamination, soil contamination, and product contamination. And all of those farms had very similar stories of, the spreading happened decades before they were currently on that land. In the case of one farm, the spreading never happened on their land, but it happened on adjacent land, and it moved into their groundwater system. And again, their water levels were extremely high, in the thousands of parts per trillion, when the threshold is 20 parts per trillion. And another livestock farm came forward that had found sources of contamination from hay that they had bought in to their farm to feed their animals. And it was extremely highly contaminated hay that spiked their milk production up again to 1,600 parts per trillion, when the state threshold is 210. And that happened over a very short period of time of feeding this highly contaminated hay. And so the second wave of farms, again, mostly did their own testing because they saw themselves on the map. They saw they were in an area that had been spread, and they didn't want to wait for the Department of Environmental Protection to come do testing on their farm. This created an extreme crisis moment, and there were not programs in place to support these farms. And the first farms, Fred Stone and the other dairy farms that experienced contamination, did not have programs in place to support them. And so MAFCA and Maine Farmland Trust, in coordination with the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry in the state, did a listening session with this phase 2 set of farms who were immediately going through this crisis situation to really understand what are the needs, what are they experiencing, how can we help, fill the gaps. And from that initial day-long meeting listening session with these farms, we really developed both a policy agenda for 2022, which we're going to share more about what came out of that, but also the need for immediate farm support programs and safety nets. These farms, none of these farms were prepared to deal with this. They all immediately lost income and had employees, had year-round markets that they were servicing. And so one of the very first needs was actually income replacement so that these farms could stay solvent while they waited on tests, while they figured out what was going to be next for their farms. And MAFCA, as well as MFT, worked together to outline, what could we do to help fill the immediate gaps. In addition to income replacement, we also heard a lot about the uncertainties and the decision making that would need to happen for each individual farm's situation and what they were working on. So I think with that, we'll just move to the next slide. So MAFCA and MFT in coordination, listening to the needs of these farms, worked to rapidly set up a few programs that we could jointly administer and that we could work in coordination with Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, DEP, and the CDC in Maine. And the first one was the PFAS Emergency Relief Fund. We were fortunate in that, our organizations collaborate closely, even outside of these crisis moments. And we had actually co-administered a COVID-19 emergency relief fund. So we already had the infrastructure set up for a similar grant program, but we quickly raised some funds from foundations and individual donors in Maine to start getting income replacement to these farms so that they could stay afloat in this moment of uncertainty. We also, to the point of all the unknowns, set up technical assistance and coordinating across the organizations to provide technical assistance, again, in coordination with the agencies to help each farm navigate their own situation. And this includes things like testing, what is their testing strategy? What products do they need to test? What thresholds do those products need to be at in order to feel comfortable or safe selling them to customers? And I should note that in the state of Maine, and Maine is one of the only states that has this, we currently have 2 thresholds for products, and that's milk and beef. And that primarily came out of that first wave of dairy farms finding contamination. We have no product thresholds for crops, fruits, other vegetables, grains. And we do know from research that different crops take up PFAS levels in different amounts. And so some crops are going to be more susceptible than others. But the decision-making that needs to happen on any individual farm, given their contamination levels, what their product mix is, and how to have a viable path forward, requires a lot of technical assistance and testing. And then research support. So like I mentioned, we provided research support to that, the organic dairy farm who found contamination in that first round, to help look at how they could get the PFAS out of the system of their cows so that they could get the milk back below the threshold and be able to sell that. And that came through testing of feed, corn silage, hay forage, different research to look at different uptake in plants. And that research agenda has been a collaborative effort to really identify what are all the needs that both research we can be doing on farms that are currently contaminated, but research that we need in the future. So go ahead and go to the next slide and back to Ellen.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So in addition to the support services that Sarah was describing, we've also been working with impacted farms to connect them with solar developers to explore opportunities to put solar arrays on land that has contamination levels so high that farming is just not possible anymore, at least until soil remediation efforts are more advanced. This provides some financial support to impacted farms without permanently developing the land if the right solar infrastructure can be used. We're also working to establish projects that couple dual use solar projects where agricultural activities are normally integrated, but this time with phytoremediation research. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We've also been advocating on behalf of farmers with the state so that farmers are getting the information, the support that they need. State agencies in Maine are really working tirelessly to address this issue, but given the magnitude of the work, there are often delays in providing farmers with information or test results or water filtration systems. And also just helping farmers understand what test results mean. And so our teams have been working with farmers to really ensure that information and support is flowing as quickly as possible. And then we've been working with farms to help them understand the issue of PFAS contamination and how it might intersect with their conservation easements if they have been protected by Maine Farmland Trust or another land trust in the state. This includes helping farms explore what PFAS contamination might mean for the value of their land, how they might be able to use their farms for other non-permanent purposes in the near term, while again, soil remediation efforts are advanced, and then how we can work with them just to make sure that, we can return the land to agriculture in the future while also helping them stay financially viable in the interim. And the next slide.
And yeah, so going back to the legislative work that we're doing, and just very quickly before I kind of dive into what happened this year, we kind of set the table for a lot of work last session with some source reduction and some testing and setting some water quality standards. And what I want to emphasize about that is the bipartisan nature of this work that we're doing. We have a governor that has been supportive of this and set up the task force, but we've also had an incredibly supportive legislature, and that is on both sides of the aisle. We have worked with legislators in both parties and generally have pretty broad bipartisan support on all of this legislation. So that just, I think, shows the importance of this issue and kind of the impact of this issue, particularly here in Maine. We're a very rural state. And so this is really impacting our farmers and also folks that own residential wells that are dealing kind of with the health impacts around this and having to deal with the testing and the costs. And one thing that did come out of some of this too is that if your well water tests high for PFAS, the State Department of Environmental Protection will work with you to provide bottled water. They will work with you to help fund a new well or filters for a well for those that are experiencing high levels of PFAS in your drinking water. So there are some state resources that the state has set up kind of outside the issue of the legislation that has passed. And so DEP and our Department of Ag have really, I think, stepped up and taken this issue seriously. I will say we at Defend would always like to see things move a little quicker, but overall the state response, both legislatively and from the agencies, has been pretty good. In terms of LD 1911, this is the bill that passed this session. This is once again a first in the nation. Maine taking the lead here again on this issue. And I'll let Representative Pluker kind of dive more into this since he was the lead sponsor on this bill. But the basic thing is that, the testing under 1600 passed last session showed all these 700 sites where a sludge had been spread, and yet the state was continuing to spread the sludge. After the Stone Ridge Farm issue, the state had put some standards in place. But what is happening was that sludge was being sent to composting facilities and turned into compost and still being spread on farmland, or some of it was just still, kind of meeting the threshold and still being spread. But the loopholes were such that they were continuing to contaminate our, clean farmland. And that didn't make much sense to us at Defend. So, we worked with Representative Pluker. And that bill was an interesting fight. It unfortunately didn't get as much support, bipartisanship, as the other bills had done. And what we were kind of running into was concerns from our company here that manages our state-run landfill, Casella, kind of stating that there wasn't enough room in the landfill to landfill all the sludge. The state disagreed with them and stated that publicly several times, that there was enough room in the landfill. And then additionally, kind of that same like multinational corporation kind of freaking out our sewer and water districts by implying to them that you know, there wasn't enough room or the cost would go up or that type of stuff. So we did manage to push back on some of that. And quite frankly, from our perspective, that even though we knew some of the costs would go up for some of our municipalities, and we are sympathetic to that, at the end of the day, the health and safety of our children and families here in the state of Maine were more important. And it was not fair for that burden to fall on our farmers. Fred Stone's spent, you know, thousands of dollars, like, you know, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 to try to fix his farm. Folks like Adam and Johanna paying for their own testing, and at the end of the day, their farm being decimated, like that, these issues should not fall on like farmers to deal with. And so at the end of the end, you know, from both a consumer protection thing, a public health perspective, from our perspective, we could not continue this process that continued to contaminate farmland. So LD 1911 passed, and the governor has since signed it. So at this point, there is a statewide ban on land application of what they euphemistically call biosolids. We hear a lot about beneficial use of biosolids. And yes, there is some beneficial use. There's some nutrients. All of that is good stuff. But at the end of the day, there's so much, not just PFAS, there are other toxins in this stuff that, to me, if you are poisoning people, that is not a beneficial use. So we were pleased that LD 1911 passed. And I think Ellen might have a little bit more to chime in here about this, or Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I just was going to add that, you know, as Sarah mentioned, there were concerns with the ban, which we also were fully supportive of. But there were some concerns raised from farmers who had come to use this sort of low cost sludge or compost derived from sludge as fertilizer on their land. And although we were very sympathetic to those concerns, we really tried to emphasize to those farmers that the costs associated with contamination far, far outweigh any increased costs, any increased fertilizer costs. And that, you know, as a state and as an agricultural community, we can't continue to spread PFAS contaminated sludge on farmland, especially given the land access challenges that exist for farmers in Maine and really across the country. I also wanted to note that one of the highlights of this session was that the recently passed supplemental budget includes $60 million to provide farmers impacted by PFAS contamination with critical resources like health monitoring, income replacement, new business models, relocation services, the buying of contaminated land, and farm management and soil remediation research. I think that what was really important in terms of being able to pass the legislation this session was for legislators to really hear directly from impacted farmers, as well as concerned farmers within the state. And that really raised the awareness of the issue for legislators. That raised awareness sort of led to the legislature's Agriculture, Conservation, Forestry Committee putting together a committee bill under the leadership of Representative Kluker. It led to the unanimous support of the committee for that legislation, the governor including the $60 million in her revised budget proposal, and then the Appropriations Committee, you know, including that within the budget, which then passed the full legislature. And I think there are a number of ways for other, you know, for folks in other states that are thinking about how you sort of put this issue in front of legislators. I think we were able to really connect legislators or public officials with impacted farmers through a variety of different means. We organized a listening session for public officials where they could hear directly from impacted farmers. We organized meetings between legislators and impacted farmers so they could hear their stories. We encourage other farms and supporters within our networks to really reach out to legislators and express the urgency of the situation and the need for support. There were editorial pieces and press conferences where farmers shared their stories. And we also produced and delivered a video about an impacted farm to legislators. And I'm just going to put the link in the chat if folks want to check out that video afterward, because I think hearing the story from the farmers themselves is really impactful. So that's all. I think it goes back to Sarah.
Yeah, and I know we're very much over time, and our apologies, so we'll try to get through this a little bit quicker. Just very briefly, I wanted to mention LD 1875. This is another bill that passed this session. We worked on this bill with our friends in the Penobscot Nation. Their concern has been that landfill leachate, which comes from Juniper Ridge, which is the state-run landfill, ends up at a wastewater treatment facility, and the effluent from that facility ends up in the river. And they have done fish testing and found high levels of PFAS in the fish in the Penobscot. Obviously, that river is very important to the Penobscot Nation. And so 1875 requires the state to come up with a plan to treat that landfill leachate for PFAS. So the state will pay for the study. They're looking at that, and hopefully they will come back to the legislature next session with a plan so that the legislature can pass legislation to move forward with that. And then I will turn it over to, I believe, Sarah for LD 2019.
Yeah, and while certainly sludge contamination is the primary source of agricultural contamination we've been looking at, I just want to mention, we passed LD 2019, which looks at another form of agricultural contamination through pesticides. And thanks again to Representative Pluker's leadership on this. We passed this bill that's in timeline with the rest of the consumer products in the state, but gives authority to the Board of Pesticides Control to work to phase out these 1,600 Maine registered pesticide products that contain PFAS that we know about. So again, we should not be contaminating farmland. We see the devastating impacts that this has for farmers, for our food, for the food that we're eating, the health of our communities, the health of our ecosystems. And so just looking at all aspects of contamination from PFAS in our agricultural systems. And next slide. So just quickly, what's going to come next? And we're going to breeze through some of these so we leave plenty of time for Representative Pluker and the questions that you all have as well. But there is so much research that is needed across the board on everything from immediate, farm management research on setting food thresholds, actionable thresholds for soil, for different crops, for livestock management, for how to, remediate livestock and soil and water, all of these things that go into the day-to-day management of a farm who may find contamination to help them figure out the viability moving forward. And, we're doing some research. Actually, the coordinated fund that we're funding is funding some small pilot testing and research projects, but there's a much larger research agenda that's needed at both the state level, but really the federal level, because this is a national issue and it's going to impact every state once they start looking for this. And I'll hand it over to you, Ellen.
Oh, great, thanks. Yeah, and so as Sarah mentioned, we're sort of working with farmers and partners and research institutions, both inside and outside of Maine, to really investigate different types of soil remediation methods, particularly phytoremediation, and looking at different crops that extract PFAS from the soil, because as we've been talking about, for some of these farms, unless they can remove the PFAS from their soil, farming is just not going to be possible on that land. There are intersections with solar siting again. Some of the projects we're looking at, as I mentioned before, are sort of dual use solar projects, where you can sort of raise the panels up, spread them out. Normally, sort of revenue generating agricultural activities are integrated with them, but under these models, instead, phytoremediation or the growing of different crops that could extract the PFAS would be grown along with the solar panels. And it's sort of, if we can sort of move this type of model forward, it would be a way to provide an impacted farmer with some supplemental income while also working to remediate the soil. We're also, as we mentioned, part of the $60 million fund will be supporting a buyout program for farms whose land is so contaminated that farming is just not possible in the near term. And we've been sort of working with the state to explore ways that we might be able to be helpful in that effort, sort of playing a front end role like we've done with income support with the fund, but in this case, sort of being able to more quickly move upon a buyout program to provide farmers with relief earlier on. And then finally, federal advocacy we're about to talk about. All of our organizations have been very involved in federal advocacy efforts because although the state has really done a great job in being very proactive about this issue, this is an issue that affects the entire country and really requires federal action. Next slide, please. And so I'm just going to breeze through this again. I mean, this is a map that was put together by the Environmental Working Group. It really, though, brings home the fact that PFAS is a national issue. If you look at the map, actually, that map does not reflect potential contamination from the land application of residuals or sludge. But the Environmental Working Group did do a separate analysis where they found that up to 5% of all cropland in the United States, or 20 million acres, could potentially be contaminated. And that's based on sort of state reports of sludge spreading that were sent to the EPA. We know that sludge spreading programs for both municipal sludge as well as industrial sludge have been approved in all 50 states. And so there's at least the potential for significant contamination across the country. The EPA did, put forward its strategic plan for addressing PFAS, but unfortunately, it only agreed to complete a risk assessment for PFOA and PFAS in sludge by the winter of 2024. And as we discussed earlier, we pursued a ban of land application on farmland this session because we know that this is, a serious source of contamination, and we don't want to continue to contaminate farmland in Maine or anywhere across the country. Next slide, please. And this is Sarah, I believe.
So we definitely need federal action on this across the board. And I'm so glad there's so many folks from around the country on this call today. The three agencies that cover different aspects of this are FDA, EPA, and USDA. And so when we look at FDA and food safety, we need definitely more stringent testing for PFAS in the food supply. We know that when you look for it, you will find it. And we need set federal action thresholds for PFAS in food products that are based on risk in the folks that are most likely to be impacted, which are children in most cases. And this needs to be a priority in terms of research of looking at PFAS contamination within our food supply. And we need EPA actions as well. So I'll have Sarah share some of those.
Yeah, and just quickly, one of the big things that we would like to see EPA do is regulate PFAS as a class. Right now, EPA is playing whack-a-mole, where they're just regulating, one PFAS here and a different PFAS here. As Sharon mentioned at the beginning, depending on what numbers you look at, there's anywhere from 9,000 to 12,000, 14,000 different types of PFAS. So regulating them one at a time just makes no sense. Maine has actually, in all of our statutes, regulates PFAS as a class. And the federal government, we believe, needs to follow suit. They also need to classify PFAS as a hazardous substance to allow CERCLA laws to go into effect, which means that states can access super funds to clean up PFAS contamination. They are looking to classify, I think it's PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substance, but we want them to look at the entire class. That is, PFOA and PFOS are the older PFAS that are not really used very much anymore. And so these newer ones, the shorter chain PFAS, you'll hear people say, are the ones that are up and coming, and they're exhibiting the same bioaccumulation, the same health impacts of these other PFAS. And so we need to regulate PFAS as a class. We need the feds to set action thresholds for PFAS in drinking water and biosolids, and to make contamination from biosolids a research priority. Once again, they're looking at setting thresholds for PFAS in drinking water, but not as a class. They're looking at, once again, the PFOS and the PFOAs, and that just is, from our perspective, kind of unacceptable. Next slide. And then congressional response is also needed. So there's some legislation that's in front of Congress right now, and I know that you're like, why does makeup matter? Why do food containers matter? Because this is source reduction. Food containers are a major source of contamination for folks. So we would like Congress to pass these laws. Also protect our firefighters. Once again, that's a source reduction. And they need to provide funding to the states for impacted communities, remediation costs, and they need to help municipalities deal with the increased costs due to this PFAS contamination. Municipalities are seeing increased costs for having to landfill the sludge, for water contamination, all of these different types of things. Our sewer and water districts, our municipalities need some assistance. And so next slide.
I think we need to get Bill in here, Representative Pluker, if we could, as soon as possible.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'll just say in a sentence that although we're still trying to analyze, the different ways that USDA programming can be helpful for impacted farmers, these are some of the areas that we think should really be explored. And I do want to say that we're very appreciative of the Maine offices of NRCS, FSA, Rural Development, who are really trying to explore the use of different USDA programs to provide support for farmers who are facing these impacts. So I'll stop there.
Okay, and we can also circle back on some of these, in the Q&A and get into some of this in a little more detail. But I did want to give Representative Pluker a chance to comment on all that's come before. And there's some of the areas that I know that you were particularly involved with, Representative, around the pesticide bill. There's a couple of questions about pesticide and PFAS, and also the farmer safety net bill, which was referenced by a number of people, the $60 million. But I think that's a really significant piece of legislation that you were heavily involved in, and I think would be of interest to our audience. So I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sharon, and for the invitation. Thanks for the chance to speak. And I just wanted to throw out there, without the support of Ellen from Maine Farmland Trust and Sarah from Defend Our Health and MAFCA, none of this legislation would have happened. And it's really just taken a team to push this through. I mean, they use the depth of policy knowledge that these folks just kind of downloaded to you is amazing. And putting together that kind of community, that kind of core group who is going to push this legislation through on the state level is so key and so important. I was going to talk kind of big picture for half a second, then go into some of the details that I was going to that I wanted to hit there around 2019, which is the pesticide bill and our larger remediation and income replacement bill. But because I'm a farmer, I'm a part-time legislator, I don't necessarily have all the policy details, and that's why this team is so important to kind of hold me up as we go through the process. But I hear a lot of the talking points, right? The talking points for this work and the talking points against this work that we work through while we're in the legislature. So I think the biggest thing, kind of if you are looking at taking political action to support this work, it's important to be clear that if you are looking to hold back the contamination of PFAS, and whether it be in our land, soil, or water, that you are being pro-farmer. That is your message. You are working for agriculture, you are working for the food supply, and you are working for farmers. And I think that is kind of where the opposition often tries to stand, that no, the farmers shouldn't have to worry about PFAS because it's a long-term issue. It's everywhere. Why should farmers have to take the burden of this when it's a societal issue? And the fact is that the farmers, just like we heard Johanna and Adam, we're not only are we in many cases we are the ones most affected. So we need to step out and protect our farmers, not only their family and their businesses, but we also need to protect our food supply, because everything we do as a government, to me as a farmer, comes down to protecting our food supply, protecting our democracy. And I think in times like this, when we see supply chain issues, whether it be from COVID or now the after effects of COVID, it makes local food, local farms, local food supply all that much more significant and important. And PFAS is core to that conversation in the coming years. So number one, PFAS is everywhere. We can't do anything. No, you have to take these actions. We have to cut off we have to, just as Sarah was saying around we have to make sure it's not in our food containers, make sure it's not in our cosmetics. We also got to make sure we're not putting it on the ground and spreading that. And one of the issues, one of the talking points we heard back to that was what farmers need this for as a cheap source of fertility, right? It's in the end, it's going to cost us so much more. The application of the sludge and the PFAS in the ground, it will always cost us so much more than the short-term nitrogen that it might be providing for us. And so we need to make sure that farmers have good sources of nitrogen that don't involve the application of PFAS. And then the other part is when we're looking at specifically around the use of pesticides, is they're saying, well, farmers are already taking the brunt of PFAS issues. We're taking the brunt from climate change. We're taking the brunt from all these sources. And so we need every tool in our toolkit. We can't start limiting the use of their tools that they have. But the fact is that if, as a state, we're going to take responsibility for the remediation and the income replacement for farmers who are affected, they can't continue to apply PFAS to their land, whether that be in the form of pesticides, adjuvants, or sludge. That's just the inconsistent message to say, yes, continue polluting while we also pay you to clean up the issue. It has to, so those two things, we want to help, but we also got to say you can't use these anymore. And really, while you say it's a tool, it's not a true tool. It's hurting you, it's hurting your family. And especially on the small family farms we have here in Maine, that you can't apply PFAS, whether it be in sludge or pesticides around your home, and not expect it's going to come back and affect your children and your own health. And I think then the final kind of talking point that's important to me as a legislator working on these issues is that this is not just for the farmers who are directly have contamination in their bodies and in their food and in their soil. It's for all of us it's for all farmers. It's for our entire agricultural industry, because Maine markets itself as a brand, right? So we have our food, we expect our food to be clean and pure. And so we got to make sure that the department and the government as a whole is stepping forward to ensure those people who are buying our food, those people who are producing our food, can have the trust in the system that the food that's being sold is clean. And so when we already have farmers who have not been affected by PFAS contamination, and their consumers, their buyers are coming to them and saying, hey, is your food clean? How do you prove it? And we need to make sure that we have programs to step up and say, hey, I'm certified clean, or I've taken these steps to be clean. I'm working with my partners to make sure I'm clean, so that we know as a state, when people buy Maine food, that they can have trust in it and have confidence in it. And then just going back around, I'm going to speak to LD 2019, which was the bill giving the Board of Pesticide Control the authority to regulate the use of PFAS in pesticides in the state of Maine. And so this actually came out of an earlier bill, which was LD 264, which turned into a study. So the Board of Pesticide Control spent 9 months looking at what they would need, what sort of statutory authority they would need in order to address the issue. And this was also coming out of a larger story out of Massachusetts, where they had mistakenly applied contaminated pesticides for the control of mosquitoes over millions of acres in the state of Massachusetts. And so what EPA has figured out since then, and other private labs, is that contamination came from the storage of the pesticides. It wasn't used in the manufacture of them, but they were stored in fluorinated plastic HDPE containers. And so that created a PFAS problem and contamination. So what was important to us is that the Board of Pesticide Control not only regulates the pesticides, but they also regulate the containers that they're stored in. And that science is ongoing at the federal level. And so we want them to be able to kind of move and adjust the regulations and their rules as the science is uncovered. The other part of it is that we were finding that as important as pesticides is to regulate, but adjuvants, which are things which are added to pesticides to make them stickier or to change the way that they flow out of sprayers, are also potentially a very high source of PFAS. So we wanted to make sure, and I know majority of states don't regulate adjuvants along with their pesticides. So we want to make sure that nobody was adding a component that wasn't pre-mixed to the pesticide that would accidentally create an issue with PFAS and PFAS application. And then the other part was touched on by our crew here, which is that it's so important to have a clear definition of PFAS. So the EPA right now is coming through saying that, and Sarah probably knows the more details around it than I do, but trying to kind of confuse the issue around, is PFAS one fluorinated carbon or is it multiple fluorinated carbons? And we want, in the state of Maine, in our statute, we're clear that anything with fluorinated carbons in that chain is a PFAS, and so therefore we have the right to regulate it, just as we do the rest of our PFASs. And then going into the bill, which originally was LD 2013, which turned into kind of our remediation and an income replacement bill. Other aspects of it that I wanted to kind of highlight was that we're also added, there are a lot Did I lose you there for a second?
Are you back? Yeah, we lost you. In addition to a PFAS problem, Maine has extremely poor internet connections throughout much of rural Maine. Go ahead, Representative.
Yeah, I was going to say, let me walk back towards my notes here. Oh, they're trying to help residential well owners and people who are contaminated with their residential wells. And that's part of this larger bill of helping our agriculture, but also helping the folks around it.
Well, and also just to mention I think you meant the health monitoring, which is a key part of that. Yeah.
Yeah, so health monitoring for both the farmers and the people who are infected by contaminated well water. And then also we're looking at irrigation well testing for the farmers and making sure that we can put filtration on their irrigation wells and that important aspect. And then we also talked about technical assistance, but just what we've found is that if you're eating the fruit of a plant, it has much less of the PFAS in it than than the actual structure of the plant. So a vegetable, so I'm comparing a tomato to kale or chard or something like that, you're less likely. So there is a lot of work to be done around what could potentially be grown in places safely. Other things like grains, if you're just eating the grain itself, it doesn't have a lot of PFAS in it. And I think I might have run through all my notes there real fast, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, great. And I think we do have a lot of questions. One of the first ones I'll take a crack at, because it's kind of it says a background question, is essentially all wastewater that goes to sewage treatment plants now contaminated with PFAS? And if the sludge isn't spread on farms, where else can it go? I mentioned how ubiquitous the use of PFAS is. It's in clothing that gets washed in your washing machine. It goes into the wastewater treatment plant. So, all of that stuff that goes into from a municipal treatment plant, a lot of is coming from households. But in addition, for example, in the state of Maine, we had paper mills discharging into municipal treatment plants, and they might treat their waste for some things that are required to be treated, but PFAS is not one of them, and wastewater treatment plants do not control for PFAS or correct it. Tanneries are another example. Any textile facilities, a lot of those are going into your municipal wastewater treatment plant. So yes, in effect, all of these wastewater treatment plants have PFAS in them. And as Sarah Woodbury mentioned, when the DEP started testing sludges in the state of Maine, indeed, they were all contaminated. And just a point about that, landfills as well, all of that municipal trash is actually generating leachate, which have PFAS in it. It's killing wildlife that are feeding on it. We won't get into the wildlife issue, but there's a wildlife issue as well. And so that's why we have legislation now that says, okay, yeah, you can't put it on the ground. It has to go into a landfill, but that leachate has to be tested and treated, or it can't go right back into the water. It has to be kind of a closed loop system until we have better technologies to actually destroy this chemical permanently. So that was just a background question. There was a question going just back to the pesticide issue. There was a question about the blueberry fields and whether there's any concern that blueberry fields have been sprayed over many years with pesticides containing PFAS. Does anyone want to take a crack at that?
Sure. So what we found is that most of our pesticides do not have PFAS in them, fortunately, but it does also depend upon storage and also depends upon some of the adjuvants that were used. But then at the same time, there definitely has been some smaller scale spreading in some of our blueberry spit fields and stuff like that. So it's part of the testing that we're going to do throughout the state to get on top of exactly where possible contamination is coming from. But just off the top of my head, you know, like I said, fruit tends to pick up the PFAS a lot less than if you're eating the structure of the plant itself.
And one of the pieces of the legislation that actually came out of last year is we actually have new regulations that were finally adopted by the Board of Pesticide Control that requires reporting by any registered pesticide, and now it will also be the adjuvants, will have to state whether or not they have any PFAS in them, and that's public information. So we'll start to get a database about what's actually going on in the state of Maine. And then you'll have that information outside of the state as well, because it will be online. So a couple questions that is very specific about, are there recommended labs for PFAS and how much does it cost to test? Anyone?
Yeah, Sharon, I just dropped in the chat. I think it's the Maine DEP has a list of accredited labs to get testing done. So I put that link in the lab or in the chat, and those have a list of labs that in the state of Maine, if you want to get your water tested or anything else tested, you have to use one of those labs in order for, particularly around drinking water, if your water tests above the state standards, they want those results from one of these labs. So yeah, so you can go through one of these labs. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question, Sharon?
Just what the cost is. And I know this is something that, you know, some of the farmers are not waiting around for the state of Maine to come out and test their land. What can anyone tell us about the costs of getting your water or your land tested?
I can share
water. Oh, sorry. I don't know about soil, and Sarah probably knows that, but water itself, you can get, it generally runs between $250 to $500, depending on the lab. There is like a cheaper test that you can get for $80, but DEP won't take the results of that particular test because it's not from one of the accredited labs. So the general price is starting at around $250 for drinking water.
Ellen, was that you? Did you want to add something to that?
So I was going to add in about farms and the testing that's happening on farms in addition to water testing. So typically, if the DEP hasn't contacted a farm yet and the farm wants to do their own testing, they're going to look at water, soil, and possibly product testing like milk or hay or other products that may tell them initially if they're bringing PFAS into their farm. And those tests run about $400 to $600 each, depending on the test. And MAFCA and MFT's PFAS Emergency Fund does have a testing reimbursement portion. And we're finding that, you know, on average, farms need at least, 2 to 3 tests to get that initial baseline across their products. So our grants for that are averaging about $1,500 per farm.
Okay. And there's a bunch of questions here. We all want the silver bullet, to fix this problem. So there's a couple of questions about, what are the magic crops that are going to reduce levels of PFAS? And, is there any hope for soil remediation in terms of technologies out there? Does anyone have information on that? Is there hope?
Yeah, I can share some information. So we've been in sort of soil remediation is very important. And so we've been reaching out to research institutions really across the country and even internationally, just to try and wrap our arms around what the state of research looks like with respect to soil remediation. I mean, there are some sort of promising indicators for certain crops that seem to be able to extract PFAS. I think hemp has been in the news. Fescue is another type of grass that seems to have extractive qualities to it. There's work being done around different fungi and the remediation qualities that might exist there. But the truth is that a lot of this research is really in its infancy. And so that's why we need a lot of investment in it to really sort of ramp up research and move it forward. I mean, our perspective is we're not willing to take the position that we're going to just write off all of this farmland forever. You know, as I said before, given all of the farmland access challenges that exist in Maine and across the country, we need to, you know, return this land to agricultural production as quickly as we can, but it is going to need a significant investment in research to make that happen.
And then just to piggyback off that, all of this work of like hemp and all of these things that are kind of extracting PFAS from the ground, you still have the PFAS in the hemp and you still have it in these products, and that still needs to be disposed of. And right now there's no good way to destroy PFAS. There's just not. The federal government is doing some work and look into that. But the truth is that's down the road a ways. So these things just end up in the landfill. Incineration is not a good option. All it does is break those PFAS down into smaller PFAS, and then they get in the air and they travel great distances, and then they join back up into, you know, probably more problematic PFAS, like the A chain and stuff like that. So, you know, the DOD actually has a moratorium on incineration because of the concerns around burning of PFAS. So I would, you know, so it's great. Yes, we definitely want to support these studies that are looking at ways to pull up the PFAS out of the ground. But we also just need to be aware that that has to go someplace, and we just don't have a good option for that right now. Here in Maine, also the Anson-Madison wastewater treatment facility got some federal dollars to look at ways to do some treatment of landfill leachate. And so hopefully they're going to put a system in place there to do some work to treat the leachate, which will help with source reduction. That is also a few years down the road, and it's not cheap. So so unfortunately, while there is some ways to like clean up the farmland in terms of actually destroying the PFAS, I think we're a few years away from something that's going to be really helpful there.
There's a couple of questions that maybe I'll take a first crack at about, so what's going on in other states? I mean, do other states have the same problem? Why is Maine have this problem? You know, and how would we find out what's going on in these other states? I mean, first of all, as we've discussed, every single wastewater treatment facility that's getting municipal waste, and certainly those that are getting manufacturing waste that have been associated with PFAS, like I mentioned, the paper industry, textile industry, et cetera, they have PFAS in their sludge. That's where it goes. So and since all 50 states have been spreading sludge, and even if they're not spreading it today, if they were spreading it 30 years ago, you know, the contaminated soil in the Songbird farm was from like, some of that was from like 30 years ago. So it's still contaminating. So it's impossible for me to believe that there isn't a significant PFAS problem in, you know, every state in the nation, but particularly states that have spreading of cropland where they're associated with some of these industrial dischargers that have been associated with PFAS, like the paper industry. And the way DEP, the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, has been scoping this out is they do have a database that goes back 30 plus years of the permits that were granted. Now, we don't always know whether those permits were actually acted upon, and some of the permits involve multiple sites, but that is where the DEP, the Maine DEP database comes from. Now, I don't know the extent to which other states have a good database. The DEP one was on paper, much of it. It actually was quite complicated and took a lot of staff and intern time to turn it into the map that you saw there, showing those sites and prioritizing them. But that's the kind of work that should go on in other states. And from a perspective of those in Maine, you know, this is not a Maine specific problem. This is a problem across this country. And one of the reasons this webinar is really important, I think, is to try to get the word out around the country that there needs to be more focus on the spreading. And of course, there's a very strong incentive not to go look, because if you look, you will find it. And that is going to cost money, and that's going to be harmful to farmers. And so I think that there's kind of a political, you know, imperative at sort of, you know, in government not to know too much about it. But that is not going to make the problem go away. And so it really is going to be important. And I think that this is where the federal government comes in. And I know we cut short that discussion, and maybe we should go back to it. But the federal government needs to be focusing on this. And when it's just Maine saying there's a problem, that isn't happening. And so it's going to be really important to have people in other states knocking on the door of the federal government saying, you need to be focusing on this because this is going to be a problem for us as well. I see Sarah. Sarah's unmuted herself.
I will say the
Go for
states
it.
are doing some work, not necessarily on the sludge spreading issue, but on the source reduction issue. Several states have passed bans on discharge of firefighting foam. Colorado just passed legislation that banned the use of PFAS in rugs, carpets, and aftermarket stain treatments, and a couple of other product categories. California has done some work around this. Washington State has banned PFAS in food packaging. Vermont has done some work. Michigan has done some work is working with industry around the sludge issue. And I do agree with Sharon that we would like the federal government to take action on this, but the federal government is a massive bureaucracy and they are slow. And they are looking at PFAS from an individual PFAS perspective. They are not looking at PFAS as a class. And states, quite frankly, always lead the way on chemical regulation. So we need more states to step up. We've had meetings with Senator Collins where she has said, look, we want to get more funding and we want to get more stuff done, but it's only Maine saying it's a problem so other people can ignore us. So we need other states to start doing some of this testing. And Senator Collins asked Secretary Vilsack outright about a ban on sludge spreading, and he said no. So the federal government was not willing to take that step yet. So we really need other states to kind of step up and help Maine out here, because as Sharon said, it's not a Maine problem. It's just that we happen to have a government and agencies that have been pretty proactive, and a legislature that has also been very supportive of this. So we've been lucky, but that has fallen on the backs of Fred Stone and Adam and Johanna and the Toziers. These people have lost their livelihoods and are dealing with health impacts. And the only reason we got as far as we did is because there were these stories to tell. But other farmers see what happened to them and are like, we don't want that to happen to us, so we're not going to say anything.
Yeah, and maybe we can circle, since we're talking about federal action, we did cut the discussion short on what could be done on the federal level. And I have some specific questions. One is from my colleague, one of my colleagues at IETP. Has USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service been helpful in communicating or commissioning PFAS in soils and water research? And Ellen, are you focused on this through NSEC and other organizations working with the feds?
Yeah, so I will say our NRCS office in Maine, our state office has been, very supportive in trying to figure out ways of using existing programs to help provide support to impacted farmers, as well as, support research efforts. I think, they're constrained by some of the programmatic requirements that exist for some of those programs, and they have been trying to sort of communicate with the national office to make alterations to those programs that would allow for some support. One of the items listed on that slide, was to think about the Conservation Reserve Program and being able to sort of take PFAS contaminated lands out of production, but enroll them in CRP so that there is sort of lease payments and some cost share assistance to farmers who have that land. I think some of the roadblocks, though, have emerged because of the fact that we don't know exactly how PFAS will be regulated on the federal level in terms of its designation as a hazardous substance. And because of that, there's a lot of trepidation about what that will mean once and if that designation happens, and how it will implicate some of the other programming. So I think that's why we need this sort of multifaceted approach, where we're sort of pushing through federal action through USDA, but also through EPA and FDA at the same time.
Okay, anyone want to add anything to that? I know Michael Happ from IETP, who's helping with the tech here and the questions, also knows a bit about that. Do you have anything to add to that, Michael? Not to put you on the spot, but
no, I think Ellen put it really well, and there's definitely we're open to ideas on how to address this federally, including ways to look at disaster payments, and again expanding conservation programs to prioritize PFAS contaminated land. But yeah, definitely something we're still exploring. But that list on that slide is a good starting point.
And, I would just say, there's a lot of federal programs that are implicated. When we were working on the legislation, what I've been calling the Farmer Safety Net bill, the 60 million, there's issues, and this is certainly something that Maine Farmland Trust works a lot with, but around easements and around, if someone has a mortgage and someone's, so is that through the Farm Credit, Administration? Is it through a bank? Is it, how is that going to work? What happens if you have to move the farm somewhere else because you can't really remediate something that's been, contaminated for 30 years and it's at such high levels still? So there's a lot of complexity here, and it really takes, it's going to take some federal thinking about it and willingness to think about it. And, as been pointed out also on the EPA end, they're so far behind everything. It's just, it's really not, I see from the chat that someone's posting about, New York's going to wait until the Feds act. That's just not going to happen, no matter who's in the administration in Washington. Even now, where they're being a little more proactive, it's the timelines are so far out into the future that, and the chemistry, they keep introducing new ones. So it's just not really going to end there. Michael, you've been looking at these questions, and there's a lot of them. Are there some themes here that I've completely missed because I'm scrolling through that I should catch up on? I want to just mention a couple of people mentioned that solar panels have PFAS in them. So, I don't know, if that's just for your information thing, but, just to ask the question, how does that relate to these programs that people are looking at trying to share agricultural land, either that's already been contaminated with PFAS or, that's not yet that we know of?
Yeah, well, actually, so some of the study designs actually include analyzing whether there's any sort of transference between PFAS, but any other chemicals that might sort of exist within solar panels into the ground. That's something that the solar industry has been saying for a while, but this is also an opportunity just to study that and verify those claims as well.
Okay. Here's an interesting question, and I think it's going to be more and more relevant with climate change. Suddenly lost it, but it was about states that have a lot of flooding, like flooding events like Vermont, Hurricane Irene. I'm very familiar with that. I'm a native Vermonter. Are they susceptible to more leaching issues from PFAS? I sure don't know the answer to that.
I guess what I'll just add, I don't know that specific answer, but we know that it does move through waterways, that it's highly variable, that it's moving all the time. And I think in Maine, one of the things we didn't really talk about, but there was just a new guidance that came out from the state about PFAS contamination in fish that are in our lakes and streams. And I know there's more research being done about shellfish and finfish in the oceans. And, all of the PFAS that is being land applied is going into groundwater, is going into surface waters, is moving throughout the water system. And so, yeah, I would guess anytime there's a flooding event or anything else, it's just going to move it that much further from the source of wherever the contamination may have existed currently. And one other thing, just to tap back into that federal discussion that I think is a takeaway for me from our experience here in Maine, is that absolutely we need regulation at the federal level, we need it at the state level. But first and foremost, we need farmer safety nets in place when it comes to PFAS in agriculture. Farmers cannot be left holding the responsibility for contamination that's found. It inevitably will be found in every state. And we need a robust federal safety net program in place. The only program that's really, there are no real programs designed to address PFAS contamination in agriculture at the federal level. And the only program that has been successfully used to date is the Dairy Indemnity payment program for dairy products that have been found to have contamination, not PFAS specific, but any contamination or adulteration. And so, you know, I think our early farms and even the farms in the second wave, like we would not have the state legislation around farmer safety nets had they not raised their voices, but they definitely have had to hold a heavy burden of the finding of this contamination that hopefully no other farm should have to hold. But we need robust safety nets in place at the federal level in order to make sure that that doesn't happen to other farms.
And just I agree with Sarah on this, that we need some farmer safety programs at the federal level. The other thing we need is from the manufacturers of this stuff to pick up the tab here. So all of this cost is falling on our states, it's falling on taxpayers, it's falling on our states, it's falling on the federal government, our municipalities. Even though the land spreading program was a state-sponsored program, it was a federally sponsored program, they did not put that PFAS in there. Like, the municipalities are not adding PFAS, the sewer districts are not adding PFAS to the wastewater stream. It is not their fault. It is not the farmer's fault that ends up on their land. And so the folks that need to take responsibility for this are the 3Ms and the Chemours and the DuPonts of the world that have created these chemicals. And so I know the Maine Attorney General is looking at a class action lawsuit. I know other states have also looked into this and are doing this. There are a couple of folks in the Fairfield area that are looking at these are the folks with the contaminated wells that are looking at their own class action lawsuits against some of these manufacturers. The state of Maine passed legislation 2 years ago that made it easier for people that are impacted by PFAS contamination to go after these chemical manufacturers. It updated the statute of limitations. So at the end of the day, while yes, the federal government and the state both need to step up to help these farmers, at the end of the day, the people that need to be paying are these billion-dollar corporations that are kind of getting away with stuff right now. So we need the states. Hopefully these class action lawsuits can go forward. Those take a lot of time, but I think those are necessary steps. Absolutely.
Polluter should pay. And, that's a basic principle that is not actually being followed in this case. Here's a question that I know that we at least have a partial answer to. And that is, would there be PFAS in the bags of cow or sheep manure you buy in stores for home gardeners? In other words, is there a human waste component in these bags? Well, we know that there are home garden fertilizers that are actually made from sewage sludge. And those do have PFAS in them. And there was a report that came out that the Sierra Club did with an organization in Michigan that found just that. And I can't speak to the cow and sheep manure, but this fertilizer is going to be banned in the state of Maine based on the sludge ban. That it was also banned, the fertilizer that was derived from sludge through composting and all of that. So these products won't be sold in the state of Maine, but it is hard to identify them. And sometimes they say like natural on them. So you really need to investigate what they are before you put them on your garden. Anyone have anything to add to that? Okay, so Michael, what have I missed here? We've got exactly 10 minutes. And also, if there's issues that people feel like that any of the panelists feel they didn't really get into, but they're important to bring out now, would be the time to do that. So
there are a couple of questions about disposal. One from Corey is asking about disposal guidelines for PFAS contaminated milk. And then Francesca is asking, are there alternatives to killing affected livestock?
I can share what has been happening in Maine. There may be other solutions, but on the livestock piece first, yes, the animals will eliminate the PFAS from their body over time. There's a different half-life for each PFAS chemical in each different kind of livestock. Chickens turn out to have like the fastest half-life and can get it out of their systems and the eggs that they produce fairly quickly. Cows, pigs, sheep, each animal has a different half-life. But we do know from our dairy research that once, if we just use dairy cows as an example, once they're provided clean water and clean feed and the sources of contamination have been eliminated, they do get that out of their system over time. But it takes time, and that may not be viable in every farm situation, depending on the level of contamination that exists. And we do have one farm in Maine right now who's currently milking 2 herds because they had contamination in their dairy herd. And this gets to the story that Ellen shared in the chat earlier, but they're currently milking a clean herd. They also have to milk the herd that is contaminated to get that out, but all of that milk has to go into a waste stream. So it is not a usable product. And because it contains PFAS, should not be applied on land or used in any sort of like agricultural manner, because the PFAS doesn't go anywhere, right? It's going from the animal into the milk, into wherever that milk is dumped. And so most of the solution that's happening right now is that if there is a high level of contamination on the land, animals or the waste is being reapplied back to that land because there is nowhere else to put it, and that land is likely going to be out of production anyway. So animal composting and waste disposal has happened on farms that are already contaminated on that land, and other products are being landfilled, unfortunately, because there really is not another solution to it in this moment.
Do you have some other missed questions there, Michael?
Yeah, there's a question from Molly Carey asking about if there's a current backlog for farmers who choose to seek private testing from accredited labs.
I know there was.
Yeah, there currently is. Sorry, I wasn't sure if somebody else is going to jump in there, but yes, there is a backlog. It's variable depending on the lab. And right now it's anywhere from 2 weeks to 12 weeks is what I'm hearing, depending on the lab and the source.
And that's for water testing, right? Or blood testing.
That's for all testing.
Yeah. But, you know, because we're just emerging from winter finally in the state of Maine, and most of, you know, the soils have been frozen. So like the state program that was going out and testing soils, you know, they couldn't do it when they're frozen. So that's going to start up again. So there's, you know, there's a number of challenges there with the testing, you know, regime. So I just want to point out that in the chat, people have been posting some really great links to the fertilizer study information. Like if you see biosolids on the packaging, don't buy it, and tell the store you don't want them stocking it. Maybe be the next thing to do. And also just to mention that we are recording this event, and we will be posting it on the IETP website, and we will be sending out also an email to follow up with anybody who registered, you know, with the recording, so that you will have that to go back and take a look at. And I think that if we don't get to all the questions, these will be questions that we'll take a look at and maybe be helpful. I mean, in the last 2 minutes, do you have a roadmap coming from Brittany? Do you have a roadmap for states that are looking to approach the PFAS issue locally? Well, we're hoping that this will be a bit of a roadmap, but is there something more concrete that we can point people to? You know, just like, this is your roadmap. I mean, one thing I would say is that in Maine, you know, it didn't happen overnight, and understanding what you're dealing with is really important. So, you know, requiring the state to go out and test all of the sites where sludge was spread is a first step. Once that was done, of course, PFAS was found, and that created the energy, both politically and otherwise, to say, state, we have to do something about this, legislature, because we can't, this is not an acceptable situation. Sarah Woodbury.
Yeah, and I also think that, I mean, it's tough I think you can start with some source reduction as well. I think sometimes those are a little easier to deal with from a legislative perspective, although that also depends on where you live. But at the end of the day, the only reason Maine is getting so much done is because of the stories of these impacted communities. And it's not that we want you guys to find impacted folks, like that's the last thing we want folks to find, but they're out there. And if you have friendly farmers or farmers that care about this, that are willing to do some testing and be vocal about it, then that can go a long way. Or not even farmers, folks with residential drinking water wells. Maine has the heaviest reliance on residential wells of any other state in the nation. So this also impacts a lot of our folks here, but we're not the only state that have folks on residential wells. And so, you know, starting to do some of that testing and get some folks that are willing to be a little bit more vocal. And the other thing I just wanted to briefly mention, I know Representative Kluker said very nice things about the 3 organizations here, but I also want to reiterate that you need strong legislators, and we've had really good partners in Representative Kluker, and he's been a leader on this, and we've worked with other legislators. You know, there are legislators that care about this. We've had conversations with other states that want to do things. And so reach out to your senators or your representatives and start having these conversations and see where you can get some movement. I mean, we had Fred, that quite frankly is the reason we got so much done, is we had this gentleman who was being severely impacted for it. And quite frankly, because he was the first, he's kind of gotten screwed. You know, he had a lot piled on him, and you know, his farm is decimated. He has no income. He's basically living off the kindness of strangers because we didn't have these safety nets put in place when this happened to him. Hopefully, as the state gets these programs up and running, we can get some Fred and other folks some help. But I think that if you're starting to do this stuff, you kind of need to have a 2-track thing. You can't just find the contamination because folks are not going to want to come forward. So I think you need to try to convince your policymakers that there needs to be some resources put into this as well to help these folks so they don't feel like they're, you know, standing on the edge of the cliff with no supports.
Yeah.
Well,
I just wanted to add one thing to that, which I totally agree with Sarah. And I think having, you know, I said before, I think having the centering our sort of message around farmer voices and impacted community members was really key. I also think, though, that there is a role for the public. I mean, as I mentioned, you know, we have farms that are now proactively testing for a variety of reasons, but, you know, some of those reasons is because their customers are asking them, you know, how do I know that this, you know, food isn't contaminated? How do I know it's, you know, hasn't been grown on contaminated soil, et cetera? And, you know, that's why I don't think that states will be able to ignore this issue forever, because consumers, the more, you know, tuned in they are to this issue, they're going to continue to ask these questions outside of Maine in different states as well. And, you know, people will need to sort of invest in the resources to be able to answer those questions.
Well, we're just about at time, and I thought I would give the last word to Representative Kluker, because without his hard work in the legislature, especially putting in bills maybe even ahead of time sometimes on some of this, nothing would have happened. So, Bill, why don't you just give us a final word about what to do? And I did post, by the way, IETAP has a website on PFAS as well, and a link there with some of the reports and some of the testimony and other things that we've done. But go ahead, Representative.
Thank you. Yeah, just thanks to everybody for showing up today and being interested and caring. And, you know, and that's, at the end of the day, that's what we have to build here, is the people and the community that cares about where their food is coming from, build the state government that wants to do something and be proactive on this issue. And so talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, write letters to the editor, and talk to your politicians in a simple summary there.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much. Again, I would just like to reiterate what Representative Kluker said. We're really glad. And 53 people have stuck through to the very end of this. So that is fantastic. And I know others will be watching it later when it's on in the recording. So again, thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists for participating. Thank you to Claudia and Michael for helping with the tech and the questions. And we'll continue to work on this in the future. Thanks.